Industrialized housing is, again, one solution amongst the myriad of opportunities available to us to realize housing affordability.
Mm.
I still do think that the way to housing affordability is through supply. And if you can have more supply in the market, that's going to stabilize pricing. And therefore, industrialized housing is simply a means by which to increase that supply. At the same time, it also is also an innovation that could lead to economic growth, job creation, IP. So they have those ancillary benefits. But in the first instance, we are after creating more housing for people, for
Right.
our country mates to have a place to live in a safe and dignified way.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Activating Curiosity. I am Ryan Ware, and this conversation today is one of my favorite because it's something that's hit home for me a lot in my career, and most of you know that. It's prefabrication, industrialized construction. But today's guest has a similar path to mine from where he got started. Today's guest is Ryan Smith. He is one of the founding partners of ModX. He is currently the director of the School of Architecture at the University of Arizona. He's also a professor and an author. So I'm excited to have this conversation, Ryan, and thanks for being on Activating Curiosity.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. So before we dive into the conversation, why don't you tell a little bit more about yourself, your past, what kind of led you to this point in your career?
Yeah, thanks. I was a young architect, graduated on the West Coast, and was working for a firm doing high-end residential projects in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
I remember distinctly at a moment ordering some custom furniture for this house for a dot-commer um, from France, and thinking one night when I went home, what am I doing with my time? Why am I doing this with my time versus something else? I really enjoyed the work
Mm-hmm.
and wanted to stay in housing, but at that time decided to try and pivot and go into um, addressing the affordable housing crisis. And it
Mm-hmm.
seemed like the only way to do that was likely to take a career pivot towards academia and research. Um, Again, like I said, I was young. So I worked at the University of Oregon thereafter, then at the University of Utah, Washington State University, and now I'm at the University of Arizona, where I direct the School of Architecture. And my work over that time has really focused on trying to address housing and housing affordability,
Mm-hmm.
and doing that through the means of asking questions of how our housing is produced, both as a process and as a product. So that's been my focus. And then related to that, about a decade ago, there were many companies that came knocking, asking for the research that I had been doing, and in collaboration with Dr. Ivan Rupnik at Northeastern University, saying, hey, could you help us answer some questions for our company or help us to leverage industrialized construction for housing? So we created a consulting advisory group called ModX, which is international and really focuses on that question of institutional change that needs to happen in order for industrialized housing to make a foothold here in the United States and abroad.
So you're young, sitting around. I mean, I think we've all been there with a little spark of like, what am I doing? Um, you drove yourself towards a problem that you said, okay, like this isn't just something I need to go draft up and go get built. There's something larger here that I want to get involved in. You mentioned the research side, and I think that's where you kind of came onto my radar was this curiosity that you were having of like, hey, I got to find out why is it that we can't afford housing. Primarily, you were probably focusing in the Bay Area, but also probably nationally.
Yeah.
So when you started diving into that, like, what kind of information did you gather? What did you start seeing as sort of this trend within the industry, but also policies potentially, to even availability of funding and things like that. What were the things that you really started to say, like, hey, these are real problem areas that need to be addressed?
Yeah. So, as an academic, initially, I was in survival mode. So I was wanting to address affordable housing, but I know I needed to publish in order to stay alive and keep my job.
Right.
So, how do you do that? And I knew I had contacts in the industry, having worked in the industry as an architect in the Bay Area, but and being very interested in this topic of industrialized construction using factory-based construction to address housing affordability.
Hmm.
So, in doing that research, wrote a book. Prefab Architecture was published back in 2011, the early part of my career, and really what that you know what I realized during the writing of that book is there are what I might call internal factors
Hmm.
that limit the ability for the construction industry, in particular the housing industry, to take advantage of industrialized means. There were internal factors, meaning internal to the prefabrication industry itself,
Right.
manufacturing, design and manufacturing delivery. And then there were external factors, is what I would call them, that uh, mostly barriers that
Hmm.
limit the ability for industrialized construction either to take foothold for the companies to start up, uh, or, and even more importantly, to expand, to grow. And I would, call those institutional barriers, really.
Hmm.
And that was a big finding for me. So I'll give an example. For internal barriers, with the addition of a third partner at Modex, Ivan Rupnik, myself, and Tyler Schmetterer, who's our managing partner. He has years of experience in practice. We've coined a phrase called the three C's, which is internal challenges that the offsite or industrialized housing industry has. One is competency, the
Hmm.
industry itself. So it really is an evolution of an industry out of the manufacturing home industry, the HUD code industry, in many
Hmm.
ways. That's where our industry grew up from. And as it becomes, right, enters into new markets, multifamily housing, or say more sophisticated missing middle housing, that becomes quite a challenge to pivot skills toward from say a HUD code industry or a single family industry to a multifamily industry. It's a very different kind of
Hmm.
product and delivery system. So that would be a competency thing. Capacity, the volume throughput of individual factories, whether they be panelized factories or modular factories, is always a question. And these factories want to scale, they want to grow, but
Hmm.
they have to always temper that with the realities of supply and demand. We need more consistent throughput for those factories, right? For them to make that business proposition reality and viable. And those things together, competency and capacity equal capability. So the capability of the delivery system or the supply chain
Hmm.
to meet the demand for housing affordability is one internal big question that we have tried to help companies come to terms with.
Hmm.
And then on the other side are the external factors I mentioned, and those are mostly institutional. And I could describe those as things like building regulations, right?
Hmm.
That either allow or hinder zoning regulations, certainly, as well as finance, the workforce ecosystem, although those relate to these three C's as well, internal factors. But um, you know, regulations, finance, project delivery contracts, external
Hmm.
things that really limit the ability of industrialized housing to scale. So during the early part of my career in investigating this, those are the two major things that I recognized were internal factors and external factors, and realizing and understanding that there was going to be a need to research this from an
Hmm.
academic standpoint and then teach it once I could understand it more
Hmm.
to the students. And then ultimately understanding that for companies to get what they need out of it, it's not just research and inquiry, it's application. They need
Right.
solutions, right? And so
Right.
that's why we started taking the findings of what we were discovering in research and applying it to advising work to help these companies set up and try and scale.
Hmm. Well, I think the way you framed it, I mean, it's perfect. The competency, the capacity, the capability from that internal side when I think about factories, because both you and I kind of started in that architecture area. And I think there's one way architects look at delivering a project versus that of a contractor versus that of a factory. And I think back to when I first started using prefab or designing towards it and exploring it, it was, is it a kit of parts to wall assemblies to full blown kind of modular approach to it, right? And they all have their own terms, but it's been for me like precast, right? That's not new. I mean, precast has been around a long time. Those factories have, for the most part, been able to sustain and kind of grow and let technology kind of come in. But like you're saying with this housing side, right? That is it is a different skill set when we're building single family to that multifamily. So you're dealing with the research of those in a factory who potentially want to solve a problem, but maybe came from the industry or adjacent to the industry in one area to get an institutional buy-in to even design this way, to design, engineer it. So you brought up again, it goes back to those barriers. You mentioned the word barriers, which is what I'm always trying to understand is like, what are those obstacles? What are those barriers?
Sure.
You mentioned regulations. And I know even for the modular world, it's the cash flow through a project. It's the financing, it's getting insurance, it's getting groups to fund the project where a developer may want to go this direction and utilize these solutions, but they can't get the they can't get the finance for it because banks don't want to front that much money because it's more front loaded to go get things done in a factory versus procuring material and then paying for labor in a typical schedule work or project cash flow. So you're recognizing that early on when you're starting to do the research. What what have you seen take place since you've done that research in those 10 years now with ModX of some of the things that are starting to help those obstacles?
Yeah. Um, Something we have done at ModX that started back in, say, 2015, 2016, um, starting this research 10 years ago as an advisory group, was the recognition that there were models out there.
Mhm,
There were construction contexts out there that had success in delivering industrialized housing at scale. And what is it about those contexts that we can learn and glean from in the United States and apply to our situation? And then
mhm,
as we uncovered that, we realized that back in the 1960s, 70s, the United States actually had started a very robust industrialized housing sector, and it dwindled. And
mhm,
so, what are the lessons from that past as well that we could look to try to reinvigorate or recreate our industrialized housing landscape here in the United States? So, some of the international precedents we looked at and have been looking at for a long time and continue to look at. We are taking people back to these contexts this year. So, we have a trip to Sweden and Japan this year.
mhm.
Um, and I'm not saying that you can transport or transpose an entire construction culture to the United States. There is no way to do that. And in the
Right,
US, let's be frank, we have maybe a dozen or more unique construction regional contexts that
right,
exist, right?
right.
For instance, the contract structures that exist in the Southeast are very different than those in the Northwest.
Yep,
So
yep.
how do you then take lessons from abroad, apply them to the United States, and which lessons do you take depending on the context here? So it's quite a complex algorithm, so to speak. But we have learned from those contexts some pretty key lessons related to your question about barriers and institutional barriers, and we have tried to model those and adopt those and work
Mhm,
with various groups here in the United States to address them and teach them and apply them to our context. So some of those are companies, for-profit companies.
Hmm.
non-government organization, nonprofits, housing advocacy organizations, both more national or regional, and then of course our ongoing and very healthy relationship with U.S. housing and urban development that continues even
Hmm.
through this recent administrative change to the Trump administration that still sees our value in trying to address the ongoing and perennial housing affordability challenge, but doing it through perhaps an industry first sort of approach, right? Let
Yeah.
industry find those solutions with the local governments. And then how can the federal government get involved to perhaps remove regulations or readjust them to allow for that industry and market to move forward? So
Hmm.
that's basically what our work has been and continues to be at ModX. And I'd be happy to talk, of course, more about some of the particulars related to that, but I wanted to paint that picture of what
Right.
we've been doing as far as translating lessons from abroad and working with these groups to do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you shared the uniqueness because I think we like to hang our hat on that, like, hey, we're unique, so therefore we can't try anything. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, but you're all human. So we still can look at our unique situation and make adjustments and apply. So like you mentioned, like, hey, we started something in the 60s and 70s and it sort of went away. But what are things that you can learn from the past? So no one's saying, hey, we don't have a housing crisis and affordability crisis.
No, no.
Right. Everyone's agreeing that this is a real problem. And you mentioned something that I think is very interesting to me. And I think the reason I started the podcast was our ability in this industry to address this problem by doing what we all do best in all of our areas that we work in, but bringing our expertise to figure out this industrialized construction, to see it as an opportunity rather than a threat. Or, I mean, let's be honest, I just talked to the AGC earlier, and it's like we've known we've had a labor force shrinking issue since the 70s. So we are paying the price now for not addressing it. So what happens as population continues to increase, or things change and dynamics change, that infrastructure starts to struggle more than it is now? Well, if we don't see this as opportunity to be an industry first approach, like you're saying, then who's coming? Like, who's going to solve it? So that to me is a huge piece that you're describing is, and I'd like you to go deeper, as you just said, is like, this isn't new. I mean, yes, there are different contract models. We all need to learn to figure those out, whether it's design build. Every region is unique and what criteria it has to design towards, right? Like, South is different than West Coast. So, but we do that every day now. Conventionally, we're just trying to learn how to integrate into a design these new methods of construction that allow us to begin to build housing at a much quicker pace to fill that supply. Um, and what you're talking about is, how do we get factories to those levels of competency, capacity, capability that are also aligned with teaching, educating, which is a lot of what you're doing, how to implement this stuff, how to, what has to happen with the design process when you are using modular, right? Or when you're bringing a factory in, and how do you start to utilize experts from other areas of the industry to bring them in? So that's not, correct me if I'm wrong, but that sounds like a lot of what you're working with teams and factories on, as well as others in teaching and education, is how to start to think differently about how these solutions get implemented into the design and the strategy from the start.
Yeah, no, no, there's a lot there. So your question touched on delivery models,
Uh-huh.
which I would call project delivery models. It also
Uh-huh.
touched on business models. So what is the business structure of those involved? So I'll touch on a few of those things. One, And then the third thing you talked about in that sort of project delivery model was design specifically and
Yeah.
the mindset around design. So at Modex, we often refer to what's called the nesting layers of industrialized construction, nesting layers of context, really. And
Hmm.
so oftentimes when we talk about industrialized construction, our thought immediately goes to the product, which is a panel or a module,
Hmm.
which I would call, right, the technology. Um, and thinking about our mind immediately goes to the factory floor and says, how are we going to be producing these things? And in many ways, that is the last step of a thought
Right.
process to think
Right.
about when delivering industrialized housing, right? So where does it start? It starts at the very outermost contextual layer, what I would call the outside of an onion, which
Hmm.
is the very institutional context in which construction and housing exists, right? Which is our
Hmm.
macro economy, which is a market. A market has a certain demand structure. And what does that look like? What housing typologies service that market in my region? What does it need? Um, what are the finance structures around that? What's the regulatory context that can allow or not allow that to happen? And all of that forms that outer layer. And then within that, a business model emerges, right? We could
Hmm.
deliver this with a certain business model. And whether that business model looks like an individual vertically integrated company doing all of the supply for that housing and housing product for that market and context, or that is a collaborative team that comes together and says, I'm an
Hmm.
architect, I'm a developer, I'm a manufacturer and a general contractor, and or 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 some of those that are stable, and then others are brought in at various times to deliver on the promise of industrialized housing. That's also a model. So that business model becomes crucial in delivering for that market. And then another smaller layer within there, within the business layer, would be what we often refer to as the product platform.
Hmm.
So what is the platform that's going to deliver those housing typologies and that business model that is ultimately going to deliver for that context? And and that platform, right, is important because think about it as a set of subassemblies that could be reconfigured in many different variations to produce difference or uniqueness with regards to different sites and different housing outputs. And then finally, within all of that is what is the technologies we're using to deliver on that
Right.
platform. So it's a very different approach, I would say, than I think how we've been thinking about it in this country.
Hmm.
And we have been trying to encourage, yes, teams, developers, architects, contractors, and of course the offsite manufacturers themselves to think about it in that way. So
Hmm.
that's an important piece to hit on a number of the points you were talking about. But maybe just to hone down into the specific question you had about what I would call the product platform or the platform approach, which is very much linked to design and the way we think about design,
Hmm.
which is thinking about design from a manufacturing mindset. And that could be a designer that's embedded within the manufacturing operation in a vertically integrated company,
Hmm.
or that could be a designer that is a third party, an architect, for example, that works to envision with those who are going to be producing what that product platform is. The worst situation is an architect, we've seen this, envisioning or ideation outside of the realm of any sort of reality of manufacturing or construction,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Right. Right.
you and I know that because we're architects and we've seen that again and again. And my students do this, and so what we often say is, no, you start immediately with a supply chain and an actual manufacturing product, and then you help develop that and think about how that might be reconfigured to deliver on different housing outputs. So we call that platform design. So
Yeah.
that's a little that takes a different kind of mindset as a designer. That takes a manufacturing mindset, which is
Right.
much more about a product that could be continuously improved over time, and every time it's utilized, that information comes back and is improved on the design and
Hmm.
the manufacturing process. So that it mimics pretty much every other manufacturing sector in that way, or would,
Right.
as opposed to how we deliver housing and construction generally today, which is a one-off bespoke delivery
Yeah.
system. So I just wanted to paint that picture of in that nesting layers where we have the context, we have a business, we have a platform, and we have technology to service that platform. This platform piece really links into design, and it requires designers, architects to think very differently about how and why they do their work, frankly.
Right. Right. Well, I've wrote a piece, I don't know, it's been a little while, on how and why we need to change the definition of means and methods in the construction industry and how
Mm,
we think about it. Because I think, as you were describing it, I'm thinking about all those students that get a chance to kind of have you as a professor and a director because of the way you're thinking about this. And I went to Kent State, and I know I've talked to the dean there, and they're doing a lot of these similar things now. We're brought into the industry. We come out of university, and we're just thrown into this mindset of like, well, this is how it's done, and we're separate, and everything's a silo, and we're not looking at it as you just described in an opportunity of interdependency. Of I'm going to think, you know, when pen hits paper as an architect, I'm already choosing the method. I'm choosing the means, I'm choosing the subs, I'm choosing all the things that I don't know much about because the contractors are going to write those downstream contracts, but I'm doing it with little exploration of is that even readily available material? Is that even readily available labor force? And as you're describing it, yeah, I know when I first started working with prefab companies, I was like, look, you're not recognizing that you're trying to sell a product that no one knows how to design with. like like someone has to teach, go be out there from the manufacturer side or somewhere else to get everyone together to understand how the process is going to change. Like, what are the questions I should be asking? How should I be thinking about this method of construction or this solution? Because it doesn't have to. You don't know. It might be kit of parts. It might be panels in some sections. It could be full blown modular. It's not. It's usually a hybrid approach on bigger buildings. But I think it's so important the way you just kind of described it is this is a mindset shift. This is a change in how we think about each of our roles and responsibilities within our professions, but as an industry, our responsibility to take a step back, think about that. Yes, things are unique, but what is my role in having this be successful, knowing there's a fabricator over here, engineer over here, and contractor over here to have more curiosity asking those questions of like, okay, I've never done this before. How do I, how do I think about my drawing set differently? How do I know what I need to detail? And also understanding like there are things you may not have to detail fully because the factory is going to be able to produce, through that technology and platform, like you said, shop drawings live, like as you're going through it, like with, design for fabrication or direct digital manufacturing and those kinds of things. So, where I was going with that was, you kind of got me thinking a lot more of just why do we keep, I mean, maybe it's legal, the legality and the contracts and the way we think about it, but we need to think about means and methods in a different way of what our rules are and actually defining those from a design side. Because the only way to think about a method of construction like prefab is that you're going to have to engage with them. You're going to have them come in and be a part of the design assist, design build, design for fabrication process to ensure that it can be more successful. So that was me kind of responding to how you framed it with the onion piece and kind of those layers. But I don't know, what do you teach the next generation? How do you approach this means and method idea, knowing the legality side of the contract? But what are your thoughts on that?
yeah, it's a good question. I think an easy answer would be to say, well, just apply integrated project delivery to housing
Right.
delivery, use that contract structure, and it'll all be
Hmm.
aces. But integrated project delivery, even as either a contract structure or as a collaborative model or an agreement that regardless of the contract you're using, an agreement of a delivery method, even that was established with regards to traditional on-site construction. That's how it was
Right.
written.
Yeah.
So off-site construction, industrialized construction is very different in many ways that I don't know any existing contract structure really services. I know the AIA is working on it and others are working on new contract structures related to
Right.
this. But that, like you're saying, doesn't necessarily solve the re-education process that's needed and reorientation of people in that way. I will just give a hint and not to give away too much of what we advise folks on, but we strongly believe in any collaborative team utilizing or wanting to utilize industrialized construction. There are two key principles. Number one, I think you do need a systems integrator. I think
Hmm.
someone on the team needs to serve that role and
Hmm.
decide to be the most educated in the room, try to learn as much as they can about this, if you're cutting your teeth on it.
Right.
And that could be the architect if they so choose, or the team thinks that's appropriate. That could be a developer if they are a hands-on developer owner, right? They want to be very involved in
Right.
leading that project. That could be the general contractor, depending one on the contract structure, but also their interest and the scale of the project. That could be the manufacturer if they become much more supply chain integrated, right? They're
Hmm.
they're they're able to move down into design or up into general contracting. So these are uh, that system integrator is one piece. The second principle I think is really important related to this is we often call it the rule of three, and this is not a popular thing to say, but you're likely going to lose money on the first one, cut even on
Yeah.
the second, and do well on the third. And that's
Yeah.
especially if you are working together and you have a commitment to figuring this out as a team, whether that's as a vertically integrated company or whether that's as entities working together in a collaboration. Um, because it's very difficult to learn, and all those kinks have to be worked out.
Hmm.
Our current development model in the United States, developer-led model, doesn't is not very forgiving with regards to losing money on the first run, right? That's
Right.
not going to
Right.
fly unless they are, understand that long-term vision of no, we're trying to develop a platform that could be used on multiple projects, and we're going to invest in that.
Hmm.
And the architects understand that there's more work coming down the pike in relationship to that. So that's just to say that uh, it's easy to talk about international precedents, but their contract structures and supply chain and delivery systems are different than they are here
Right.
in the United States. So we have to make this work for us, right? That's
Hmm.
that's the point. But some of those key principles would be, who's the systems integrator, who's going to take on that role to really lead this process and teach and continuously improve along the way. And secondly, can we keep the team more static through multiple projects to have greater successes in each iteration?
Right. Yeah, because what construction, it takes a lot of people to build one building, and then they're broken up into another project to go build something else. So, how do you get that repeatable win? And I think you shared this too. One, you started with you may lose money. Everybody will struggle in the first time that you're going to do it. Because a lot of times, either the first times we're ever touching any of these situations, and we as humans, we're not really good. That's not our best effort, right? We're still learning,
Yeah.
but we're not providing ourselves as humans that empathy side of like the bigger picture. Like you're saying, the
Mm.
problem I'm trying to solve is to get more affordable housing. The problem is to get people into housing throughout the US, but also for those all over the world. Like we have this issue. And if we're going to go industry first, like working with those developers, yes, they don't like you losing money. Neither do architects. But
Mm-mm.
it is, we are already burning fees and pushing behind on schedule, and we're losing revenue and net profitability because we can't meet any of the demands of anything, right? Like, we're not meeting the housing demand. We can't get some of the infrastructure done in a timely basis. And most people who are not in our industry, they see how slow
Oh yeah,
things take, right? So this, industrialized construction, like, it's not a silver bullet. It is a solution and a method, as you're describing, that can get integrated where everyone's kind of taking on this new approach and a role with the empathy of like, hey, this is our first time. We need to figure out this process. We need to figure out how we communicate it. We need to figure out who needs to know what when, because it's a different time. And that leads me to this, it kind of goes back to maybe a barrier of like, or a resistance for some people to use it, like a developer, others, or municipalities, is that because we're so ingrained on knowing exactly how we've always done it and that we're quicker at it, um, the manufacturer side, I can think of not just in the housing, but the modular piece, there isn't a real uniform process that is out there. And, we kind of understand because we've done conventional for so long, like what that flow feels like. But it confuses and people hesitate to take things on. And maybe you've seen this too, is like,
sure.
because every manufacturer is different, they
Hmm.
all speak differently. And this
Hmm.
isn't just within the housing world, it's like even in commercial prefab, like they all want to be special. And it's like, well, you're confusing the market. Architects, they don't want to burn their fee trying to learn yours versus their system. So, I guess I'm curious too. This goes back to that competency, because the way I've always thought about it was, if you're a manufacturer and you mentioned this, your business model is direct. Let's take a Katerra, right? Most people know on the West Coast who Katerra was. That is that fully vertically integrated
Sure.
versus, some of the groups in Boise or Calgary or wherever that are doing the housing that are modular. Well, who's doing the facade? Who's doing the podium? Who's doing all of these components down to even single family? What can the AIA, or what could other groups be doing? I mean, I know ModX is doing this too, but like,
Hmm.
how do we get everyone to understand, is like, we are creating the data every time we step onto a project. We are working together to create new processes alongside these manufacturers and not expecting every answer, because I think this is where change, we all want 100% clarity that it's going to work. So where's the data that shows that? You're a research guy.
Yeah.
Where, like, who's responsible to create that data? Where does it come from? Have we done a poor job as an industry getting architects buy-ins because the messaging potentially is off? There isn't a process,
Hmm.
or how do we get developers to recognize those? I know that's a huge question, but I'm just thinking like solving the housing crisis has to be important, and we need to get other people curious about, what they can kind of step in and start doing now.
Yeah. Good questions. I'll try to hit on a few of those points. Um, First off, you mentioned we write the process. That's true. However, as we've seen with other contract structures and building regulations, very few construction industry professionals are in a position, because of time and budget constraints,
Hmm.
to advocate and rewrite those things, right? So there are third-party organizations that work on developing our codes that we work within,
Hmm.
our standards that we work within, our project delivery contracts that we work within. And change only happens, or change management theory, which I know you talk a lot about as well. Change only happens when the pain of changing is going to be less than the pain of staying the same, doing things the same.
Right.
Um, and for whatever reason, right, we either haven't hit that point in some way, um, right, or
Hmm.
people need knowledge. The other is, people are ready to change, but they need the knowledge to know how to do that. So
Right.
I've spent a lot of time on knowledge management, theory and practice. That includes tech transfer, knowledge transfer, both
Hmm.
internationally, within a company, but also interorganizationally, like between two companies, and how that can happen. So, of course, IP issues and different things like that. But
Right.
how one educates, how one shares knowledge, how one continuously improves an industry. And I think where ModX is at now is we think that change, particularly with regards to industrialized construction and housing, is going to come by virtue of knowledge exchange and education
Hmm.
at the sort of regional scale. Because construction happens regionally and has to be applied regionally, we're advocates for that. So we are working on a current project with U.S. Housing and Urban Development and the National Institute of Building Sciences and 6 regions throughout the country to develop what we call regional action plans for accelerating and scaling industrialized housing. This project is coming to a close, but one of the key outcomes that's occurred, and we'll be writing about this in detail, is the creation of knowledge hubs within these regions to share this knowledge. And I'm not
Hmm.
talking about I'm not talking about another trade association. I'm talking about knowledge management group, communities of practice, right? Learning communities that
Yeah.
can share that knowledge together. So that's the first thing. And I think we're starting to see that emerge in some of the regions we're working with. And we would be advocates for that using, as we have seen in some other international contexts, these type of hubs be created and be quite fruitful for sharing knowledge across the industry, as well as R&D
Hmm.
kind of efforts. So the second answer to something you asked about these barriers, and yes, we're the ones who make that change and create that process as AECO professionals, is something we have learned. We learned in a project a few years ago that we've been advocating the federal government for. So I've just talked about regions and local and their role. I talk about sort of at the federal level, something that we advised the federal government on was how to scale and accelerate industrialized housing nationally. What would the
Hmm.
role of the federal government be there? And of course, immediately when you look at international precedents, people think, well, of course, these countries had great government subsidies. That's how they stood up their industrialized housing industries. But the research actually suggests that's not the case. There were government programs, just like there were in the United States post World War II, but industry led. And what ultimately they did was to align award criteria in the same direction to award criteria, meaning incentives on mortgage or
Right.
government-backed programs. Think of our programs in the U.S. for housing affordability, LIHTC, construction loans, et cetera. If you
Hmm.
were to able to incentivize the things towards innovation, performance, time, workforce safety, et cetera, that doesn't necessarily pigeonhole people into industrialized methods of construction, but suggests that we need to find more productive means for delivering
Hmm.
housing, and that could be by industrialized housing. Um, and what that suggests is instead of doing direct government subsidies or direct government procurement of housing, which we would suggest is not a good model for long-term sustainability of an
Right.
industry, right? Um, that we but we do need some sort of demand aggregation tool to allow those factories to have consistent volume throughput, or they're going to struggle. And as we have seen, we think aligning award criteria is one way to do that, and that could be done at a federal level, say
Hmm.
through finance mechanisms for housing affordability, or it could be done at say the local or region level with state programs or other things. So that's something we've talked a lot about at Podex and would be advocates for. And then the
Hmm.
second thing, and it's the big elephant in the room, is our building code regulations are, yes, we have a model code in this country, but they are adopted and enforced very differently, even from town to town
Right.
within, within a metro area, different between each metro area, municipality, different from state to state. That makes it very difficult for a team trying to deliver on industrialized housing, and especially a manufacturer trying to service multiple regions with one factory, to be able to standardize any of their processes, right?
Right.
So we're less of a advocate, and we're less of interested in pushing for standards across the industry from manufacturer to manufacturer,
Right.
and more trying to suggest that we need a standardization of process, and also building code regulations that allow for some sort of predictability on behalf of those that are delivering industrialized housing, so that they are not having to pivot at each project iteration with regards to that regulatory framework.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking more about this at ModX. We have a project emerging with the National Institute of Building Sciences to address this question of building regulations. Others are looking at this as well and trying to address this. ICC and MBI.
Hmm.
There are other groups, and I think it will be a big topic moving forward, about how we can slowly navigate and move from what I would describe as a prescriptive code that suggests how, means, it starts to suggest means and methods,
Right.
towards a performance-based code that suggests how these buildings should perform, how fast they should be delivered, um, and some other performance parameters, how they perform from an energy standpoint or from a moisture standpoint or what have you, and then let the industry innovate in order to deliver on those things. That could be new materials, new products, new systems, new subassemblies, new industrialized housing delivery. And so that's what we've been working on, both at the federal and local level, to try and address and make a pathway so those involved in industrialized housing in the supply chain can have the greatest amount of success as possible.
Hmm.
That's something that we strongly believe in. And I'll just end that comment by saying it's really easy for me and for you, right,
Hmm.
in many ways, to sit here on a high horse and talk about industrialized housing as though it's
Right.
something we have figured out, or understand, or have answers to,
Right.
when everyone really is trying to figure it out. And I have deep respect for my colleagues who are on the front lines, on the ground,
Hmm.
really the ones designing, manufacturing, and building industrialized housing today. And
Yeah.
the context they have to work in to do that is really treacherous and challenging. And all I would say is I see ModX, I see my role as trying to help those in industry to deliver on the promise of industrialized housing
Hmm.
by removing those barriers and greasing the skids, so to speak, to allow for the greatest opportunity to launch.
Yeah. I mean, that's powerful. You're right. Like, if it was figured out, we, we would not have a conversation.
Yeah, right,
But
right.
it is like, the, pr- the, the power of being human is that we get to relearn and think differently than we have in the past, which is what a lot of this is. And as you described, I do think it is powerful on the regional side. I'm here in Cleveland, and the mayor had started this endeavor to bring in fabricators to
Yeah,
do housing. They've gotten selected. They're just kind of getting started on trying to get some prototypes done. But here's a region that understands, and the mayor recognizes it. And most of them have not been in that arena. They don't come from fabrication, right? So
sure.
I am seeing those things. And then I do love this knowledge sharing piece because, like you're saying, doesn't need to be another association. My opinion is doesn't need to be another CEU. Like,
Yeah,
it should be driven on our pure curiosity to learn and want to be a part of solving this problem, as you're saying, which I know there are tremendous people out there doing this. There's Cogents is in Cleveland and throughout Ohio, and they're really looking at all of these things and the way they're approaching projects and trying to do some of this knowledge sharing and kind of that community of practice, like you said, because we are time poor. Like this whole industry struggles with it of like, well, I can't learn on the fly, so I'll just wait and do this change or implement like on the next project. But then you're spinning, you're just constantly spinning. And because there are so many different humans that are involved on every single project and you're kind of interchanging those and they're switching to different ones, it's like, well, now you gotta go back into retraining a whole nother group. So it's not, this isn't just a manufacturer's problem to solve. It
No.
isn't just the architects. It isn't just engineers or developers. It is in a going back to something you've said, we have an industry opportunity to solve this problem and to look at our uniqueness by a region. There has to be some standardization of process. We factories can't afford it. They can't afford to change every single time, and you know they go into a different region. So I think what you shared is important. I love that you guys are, from ModX side, looking at this knowledge sharing, best kind of practices area via regions, because we are human and we do want to say like where I'm located, it's the best. We know how to do it, right? So like it just makes it, it turns it into ownership, and ownership turns into commitment. That's where that buy-in starts to happen. So a lot of good work that you're sharing that I know you're doing. You're kind of spending a lot of time with students. The book was what, 2011, 2010 you mentioned. So 15 plus years, 20 plus
That's right.
years. I'm heading into my 50s. So the conversation has been the same, like a lot of the conversations. What do you think that it means? Because I'd like to make this back to the importance. What does it mean if we are unable to solve some of these problems?
Well, I think we're already seeing the housing market shift in the United States. That has happened over time. So if you just look at, say, the Architects Billing Index, which is a good indicator of where housing has gone or where it's going, if you look at the housing numbers and
Hmm.
hone in on this, right? We had uh, multi, post 2008 recession, we had an uptick in multifamily housing. And in many ways, single family and multifamily starts swapped, and multifamily really took off. That has
Right.
slowed down. That's slowed down again, right?
Hmm.
Well, let's be honest, all of housing has slowed down at this point. But what we're starting to see is a development of missing middle housing, and I think that's a very exciting area for
Hmm.
developers and AECO professionals. It's been very difficult for developers to make it pencil because a lot of it is infill, right?
Hmm.
And it doesn't scale. But I'm excited by offsite manufacturers that are coming forward with missing middle solutions that could help fill that gap. Um, your question though is, what if we can't deliver on the promise of industrialized housing? What does that mean? Let me be clear. Industrialized housing is, again, one solution amongst the myriad of opportunities available to us to realize housing affordability,
Hmm.
right? Um, I still do think that the way to housing affordability is through supply. And if you can have more supply in the market, that's going to stabilize pricing.
Hmm.
And therefore, industrialized housing is simply a means by which to increase that supply, right? That's the goal. At the same time, it also is also an innovation that could lead to economic growth, job
Hmm.
creation, IP, et cetera, et cetera. So they have those ancillary benefits. But in the first instance, we are after creating more housing for people, for
Right.
our country mates to have a place to live in a dignified way, um, safe and in dignified way. Um, but I don't. I am not. I am an optimist. I am an eternal optimist. And yet, when I wake up in the morning, and I'll just be frank. I have uh, I have children that are in their 20s right now.
Hmm.
My oldest is 26, and he does not see a future in which he can own a home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, the model of wealth creation via real estate and owning a home and then taking equity out of that home or selling that home. That has been the means by which we have built wealth in this country
Mm-hmm.
for decades. Where's the future? That may not be a future for these kids, right? It may be
Right.
that they develop wealth in alternative ways, or Ryan, they just don't develop wealth, and that's troubling. But that also suggests perhaps the country is migrating towards a very different kind of housing solution for the future, right? One that
Mm-hmm.
is much more perhaps dense, one that has different options available to folks to rent, to buy, to co-op, to share,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are different models. My 26-year-old has, right, three roommates. He has a partner and two roommates, and that's they're a tribe, they're a family, right? That's how they're
Right.
living right now, and a lot of 20 somethings are living that way
Mm-hmm.
as a result. So I think they're finding. I think the market is going to level out, but that old model of homeownership only and wealth creation through my asset, I don't, that could potentially not be a future, and that's scary for our generation because that's how we understand the economy
Right.
fundamentally. But I am interested, I guess, more so in industrialized housing as a means to deliver on the variety of options for housing typologies for that future generation so that they can live in a dignified, safe, and happy and productive way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that our country can continue to be um, a good, honest, loving place to live that
Right.
our kids can feel fulfilled and they can contribute to society. So that's where I'm at and why I continue to do my work. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I see it as a bright future, a different future for sure, but
Right.
one that I'm still very much optimistic and one that I think industrialized construction is going to play a critical role in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you shared that because I want to always bring it back to the human
Yeah.
piece, which is part of that question of tying it back towards your purpose in life, like what you're aiming to do is very unselfish of like I want to take my skill set to research and to understand and then help people start to address a problem for a whole society, a whole other part of our society. And I feel the same. I've got young kids but you sharing that story is like, hey, there is a reason we need to do this. Like
Yes.
we are only 250-year-old, nation. And to see, I know I lived in California, so I know how many units we were short every year. And there was no way we did not have the labor pool. We did not have the amount of factories to meet the supply. And as you just described, like, yes, it was generational wealth with the housing side, but like without having shelter, just the basic fundamental human things, life expectancy change, everything changes. And as a country, I mean, to me, I look at it, housing is a national security issue. In my opinion, that's just me, because if you can't get everybody safe in a house, you would now have potential of illness. You have potential with these other things, shrinking
Absolutely.
economy, everything is just tied, right? So they're all interconnected and interdependent. But like that has to be something that we don't lose sight of as an industry of like, what can we be doing during some of these areas to learn some of these things, to pique our interest, like you're saying, and to get into these groups, these knowledge sharing, to go talk with fabricators, go you know tour the factories. But I would also say from the factories, like, don't oversimplify the complicated areas or don't overcomplicate the simple. Just learn from one another. As you don't need to have a shiny message, that'll confuse an architect. Like, architects want to know how to design. How do I need to implement this? How do I need to think about it? What is my role involved? Who are the players? And that's where I think industrialized construction bring this huge opportunity in to increase all of our opportunity for net profitability on businesses and how we look to design. Because Now you can turn your focus on, as a designer, like really critical things that you're telling sub trades and skilled trades laborers that are actually still left on the project site. Like, you are solving big problems, but having key experts helping you solve problems as well. So I know that question is always one where it gets to the personal side of it, because it's something that you saw, early on in your career. Like, I want to spend my time. I want to spend my all of my energy teaching, researching, and even while you're in university out at Arizona, you're still in a knowledge base of teaching. You're constantly in this mode of like trying to help elevate others who want to be a part of kind of solving these problems. With that, then let's go to the bright side. Looking out for you at ModX, you personally, like, what does success look like?
Yeah, it's a big question. On a macro scale, the influence I would like to have with regards to housing and housing affordability in this country is to see, number one, industrialized housing have a greater percentage market share and deliver on its promise of time and productivity, right? To
Hmm.
overcome the workforce labor challenges we have and to deliver on that promise. What is that percentage? I'm not going to put a number on it on this podcast, but if I could see that, let's be honest, we're at like 2.5 to 3.5%
Yeah.
now, and have been for a long time. Wouldn't it be great to even just be at 7 or
Hmm.
10 or 15, or countries that are at 35, right? Wouldn't that be just an incredible thing? So that's something that I could see as, I would like to see as success and delivering on that notion of supply, and therefore helping to stabilize the affordability and pricing increase. Um, in order to do that, what would I like to see in my lifetime? ModX has been dedicated. I have been dedicated to really seeing systemic change happen with regards to our building code regulations, and
Hmm.
allowing, because I think that, and we have seen Japan, that is not only going to benefit the scale and acceleration of industrialized housing, that's also going to benefit, in my opinion, every other form of construction as well.
Hmm.
When you can shift the mindset from a prescriptive mode of codes and standards to a performance based standard, that allows the industry to find solutions, um, and
Hmm.
allows them to thrive. So, um, in my lifetime, I would love to see, ICC has one. I would love to see a performance based code scale in this country. I think
Yeah.
that would benefit housing. I think that benefit all of construction, frankly. To get there, ModX has been working with the National Institute of Building Sciences, and we'll be announcing this shortly, on a working group to develop an interim systems certification program, whereby at the local level, companies could certify on file with the government systems that they could use repeatedly in the
Hmm.
service of housing, so that the process of getting permitted and inspected could be expedited and much more predictable for those players. That's going to go a long way. Others
Hmm.
have been working on similar things. In my lifetime, at the end of the day, I would love to see, off on the horizon, as I'm on my deathbed, performance-based code operating in the United States would be fantastic.
Yeah.
But to get there in the short term, I think a system certification program is going to go a long way, and we are modeling this off of Japan, and you'll hear more about this
Hmm.
as we talk about it throughout the year.
Yeah. Hey, I want to see that achieved, for
Mhm.
you and everyone, because I think they're just such a critical part in helping us accelerate this, right? Accelerate the adoption, because there are so many players involved. It's not just what we think our industry is. It's, like you said, that financing side, to even with the regulators, to being able to get into a jurisdiction where there isn't the head count to even review some of this stuff fast enough. Like, the challenge is enormous, but it, as you described, it's so important for every human that we see in our communities. And seeing what you're doing with ModX, like, again, just it continues to surprise me and give me hope that there's just so many of us. Like there's 8 to 10 million of us that are really in the industry, right? The construction industry, but that there are so many people working towards achieving the solutions for a lot of these problems. And I think you shared it. It's mindset. It's finding ways to slow down, to implement, to learn, to realize that first time that you pick it up and try it, like, isn't going to be your best time. Just have empathy as a team. Have empathy within your own company, but for every person on that team, and all the way through, everybody on the site. That site superintendent now is taking on something that they've maybe never seen. It's all of our responsibility. It's all of our responsibility to ensure that the future have the housing and the infrastructure that's required. So I appreciate you sharing all of this, Ryan. It's such an important conversation, the work that Modex is doing. The last thing I'll, want to ask you is just what's some things that you think from your experience, some next steps, some real action items that somebody that they're like, I do need to look at this more. I need to think about it differently. What would you recommend?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of good literature and things out on the internet, but where it comes to is how you apply it to your operation and your business. Of course, I'm going to pitch the services of Modex to help folks do that in an
Hmm.
advising capacity. We have a three-legged stool for the business. One is B2B advising, so we directly advise companies on whether they're internal to the industrialized housing industry or they want to get into it. They're outside and they want to get in. The second thing we do is we offer unique education programs for these companies. So if they want to engage us and get their staff up to speed and get a level set, that's something we can do, or advanced education and support. And then the third thing we do is exchanges. So we take folks every year to different locations throughout the world
Hmm.
to see best practices and learn those lessons. But the key thing is on these trips are these bus conversations when we're going from place to place.
Hmm.
What did we learn? What did we just see? How could that be applicable to my business or to my region? So I think I would just offer that up. And then the last thing, which you mentioned, I mentioned early, and then you reiterated, which is develop a learning community within your region. Talk to people who are trying to do this. Um, Hold these sessions, conversations, share best practices. And as I mentioned, Modex is currently doing this with several regions, setting up hubs. We would be willing, if folks like to reach out to us, to help you get started on that journey with no intention of being involved long term. We want to help empower folks with that capacity to do that. And then lastly, I did say last, but I have one more thing to mention here, Ryan, at the end of our conversation, which is I'm also a professor and I direct a school of architecture.
Hmm.
The students that are coming through right now are a very unique generation. They're a bit disillusioned by their situation. Um,
Hmm.
I don't think they are depressed or um, resigned. I think they're disillusioned, meaning they understand that what has worked in the past for our generation is not going to necessarily work for their generation. They have
Right.
faced that reality and they are trying to find new ways to think about the future of this country and their identity and situation here living in the US and operating. I am heartened by the fact that the students I engage with every day want to do meaningful things. And they
Hmm.
want, as architects, they want to find solutions to societal and environmental problems. They really do.
Hmm.
And we have made it our mantra at the University of Arizona School of Architecture that we address the grand challenges of today. We're not interested in just making formal objects. We are
Right.
interested in research and applying that research towards finding solutions. And I think that could be a very bright future for architects to offer up a critical eye and solutions that can help move the needle with regards to big societal problems.
Hmm.
Housing being first and foremost the one that we can have an influence on. So
Yeah. I'm glad you shared that last piece you mentioned with the students. I think a lot of times we can think about the next generation. I've heard a lot of people making a lot of judgments on a generation that we have not even given a chance. And I'm hopeful. I want them to be exactly what you described, like hungry to look at it like, hey, it's our time. Like all the answers aren't going to be there, because that means they're going to be, more curious of and willing to explore, opposed to, hey, how did this always get done? Hand me this next thing. Because I know when my kids first started learning new math, I was like, I've never seen this stuff before. Like I don't know how to teach you this. And while it was frustrating to me, I was like, look, you got new problems you got to solve. So I say all that in the sense of thank you for sharing it, all of the work that you are doing, Ryan, in your purpose and passion to really zero in on this housing side and say, hey, here is one means and method, one area that we can actually start to address this if we are serious about learning how to adopt it, learning how to get it into practice. I will share all of your information in the show notes, all the links, so that anybody who wants to reach out to Ryan or any of his partners there at Modex, or hey, if you're young and you're looking for a school of architecture, I'm sure Ryan
That's
would be
right.
happy to talk to you about that. I will also say Kent State if you want a choice. So I appreciate it, Ryan. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and thanks for being on Activating Curiosity.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate the work you're doing, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. So that is the episode with Ryan Smith, the founding partner of Modex, as well as a director of architecture at the University of Arizona, professor, author, spent his whole career zeroed in on a problem, figure out how to do the research, figure out how to get it out to the public, and then say like, hey, I'm not done. I want to do more. I want to teach. I want to work with the next generation to make sure that they are curious enough about all of these methods of construction that are available to them and what industrialized construction can mean. And as well as he's thinking about our mindsets, he's talking about every part of it, whether it's architecture, engineering, developers, to the finance side, to how our codes work. I am hopeful that a lot of you will look at what Modex is doing, but also just looking for those knowledge areas and communities that he was mentioning as well, and reaching out if there's nothing in my region. How do I get one started? Those are really where we can start to make the greatest impact, because each of us taking a step towards progress and looking at these innovations, not expecting them to be those silver bullets. How can we start to look at it to help our community in which we're working? And I'm hopeful that a lot of you see this housing area as something that you particularly want to focus on, because it is something that I find so critical to what needs to be addressed in this country, in the United States, but pretty much everywhere in the world needs to address it, and that we can play a part of it. We can be a huge piece of the solution as an industry to address it. So until next time, I hope you stay well. I hope you're able to continue to look at those problems and challenges that you see that are really of interest to you, and things that you really want to focus on and solve. And I hope you're able to continue to activate your curiosity as well as the curiosity within others. The Activating Curiosity podcast is brought to you by Connective Consulting Group and Connective Coaching, part of the Curiosity Building Experiences. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss a conversation. Share the podcast with your network and help us bring more curiosity into the construction industry. Interested in becoming a guest or a sponsor? Visit us at activatingcuriosity.com for more details. Until next time, keep leading with curiosity.